June 22, 1941. At 3:15 a.m., as the first faint glow of dawn touched the western edge of the Soviet frontier, a trembling stillness hung over the vast border between Germany and the USSR, a silence so wide and heavy that it felt as if the earth itself were holding its breath, unaware that within seconds the quiet would shatter into the largest land invasion in human history, an operation so immense, so ambitious, and so catastrophic in consequence that it would reshape the trajectory of World War II and ultimately doom the very empire that launched it. And on that pale, quiet morning, as fire control officers checked their watches, as German infantry leaned forward in their trenches waiting for the signal, as Soviet border guards yawned sleepily beneath the dim glow of lanterns, the last peaceful seconds before Barbarossa slipped away forever, marking the moment Adolf Hitler began the battle he would never recover from. Across the German lines stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, an army of 3 million men stood ready. The Wehrmacht's finest divisions, the elite panzer forces, thousands of artillery pieces, all arranged with a precision Germany believed would guarantee victory before the first snows, and in the command bunkers behind them, generals reviewed Hitler's assumptions with a mix of confidence and unease. That the Soviet Union was weak, that its armies would collapse in weeks, that its people would surrender their vast territories without prolonged resistance, and that the speed of blitzkrieg, the thunderous, coordinated strike of tanks, aircraft and infantry, would bring Stalin's empire crashing down long before winter could interfere. But even among the most loyal commanders, a shadow lingered, for they knew the Soviet Union was not Poland, not France, not Belgium or Denmark, but a colossal landmass stretching across 11 time zones, with distances so immense and winters so unforgiving that Napoleon's ghost seemed to whisper warnings through the birch forests, telling of frozen rivers, starving soldiers, and an enemy who fought with the fury of a homeland under threat. And yet Hitler dismissed these anxieties with a wave of his hand, insisting that the Soviet state was a rotting structure that would collapse under a single mighty blow, bragging that the campaign would be won so quickly that German soldiers would return home before the leaves fell from the trees. And so at 3:15 a.m., the first German artillery shells arched across the sky, streaking towards Soviet outposts and igniting the dawn with thunder, waking thousands of Red Army soldiers who stumbled from their bunks in bewilderment, unable to comprehend why the earth shook beneath them, and within minutes Operation Barbarossa had exploded into motion. Panzer Group 4 surged toward the Baltic, aiming for Leningrad. Panzer Group 3 pushed into Belarus to destroy Soviet formations near Minsk. Panzer Group 2 raced toward Smolensk, clearing the path to Moscow, and far to the south, Panzer Group 1 advanced toward Ukraine, its sweeping encirclements designed to seize the region's precious grain and oil, resources Hitler believed essential for sustaining the Reich. Above them all, the Luftwaffe dominated the early skies, destroying hundreds of Soviet aircraft on the ground, leaving pilots scrambling into cockpits that were already burning, and within hours Germany controlled the air across vast portions of the front, a victory that convinced Hitler his assumptions had been correct, that Barbarossa would be the triumph that completed his European empire. But beneath this early success lay cracks invisible to Berlin. The Soviets, though stunned, did not break. Instead, they dug in, regrouped, and fought with a determination that surprised even veteran German officers, and while their command structure faltered in the opening chaos, their sheer numbers and resilience began shaping a pattern of resistance that blitzkrieg alone could not erase. For the Red Army, despite initial losses, continued to field divisions faster than the Germans could destroy them, and Soviet commanders began using the vastness of the land itself as a weapon, retreating deeper, drawing the Germans farther away from their supply bases, stretching their fuel lines thin, forcing tanks to travel distances they had never been designed for, distances where engines overheated, tracks wore down, and mechanics struggled to maintain vehicles in terrain that seemed to swallow machinery whole. As the days turned into a brutal summer of relentless advance, German infantry marched through thick forests, across rivers, through villages abandoned or burned in haste, and into battles where Soviet forces, even when encircled, continued fighting with a ferocity the Germans had not anticipated, their stubborn resistance buying time for factories far to the east, in the Ural Mountains, in Siberia, to be dismantled piece by piece and rebuilt hundreds of miles from the front, out of reach of Luftwaffe bombers, and these factories would soon pour out tanks, artillery, ammunition, and aircraft in quantities Hitler never imagined, an industrial lifeline that would transform the Soviet Union from a nation on the brink of collapse into a war machine capable of grinding down the finest army in Europe. Yet in July, as German armored spearheads captured Smolensk and pushed ever closer to Moscow, Hitler grew confident that victory was within reach, issuing new orders that fractured the strategic momentum. Instead of focusing all forces toward Moscow, he redirected critical panzer divisions south to Ukraine and north toward Leningrad, scattering the strength of his mechanized forces across a front too broad for even Germany's military genius to manage. And as the panzers rolled in different directions, precious weeks slipped away. Weeks the Soviets used to strengthen Moscow's defenses, to marshal reserve armies, to fortify rail junctions, and to prepare the defensive lines that would soon halt the German advance. Meanwhile, the summer sun began to scorch the eastern front, producing clouds of dust that clogged engines and blinded drivers, turning supply roads into endless rivers of beige powder. Tractors towing artillery collapsed on the roadside, horses struggled to breathe, and soldiers marched through heat so intense their sweat dried before it reached their collars. Yet still the German advance continued, driven by an obsession with encirclement battles that drained the Wehrmacht of time it could not afford. And then came September, when the first hints of autumn crept across the sky. Shorter days, colder nights, a faint bite in the wind that whispered warnings of the winter to come, a winter far harsher than anything German forces had ever experienced, a winter that would prove to be the most formidable defender the Soviet Union possessed. Yet Hitler dismissed these warnings as well, insisting that Moscow would fall before the cold set in, that Stalin's government was days from collapse, and that German soldiers, even without winter clothing, would endure, for victory would arrive before the first snowflake touched the ground. But nature had its own plans, and as October arrived, the skies opened with relentless rain, turning roads into mud so deep that tanks sank into it like ships in quicksand, mud so thick that supply trucks froze in place, mud so pervasive that soldiers trudging through it felt as though the earth itself sought to drag them downward into exhaustion and despair. The infamous Rasputitsa, the season of mud, halted the Wehrmacht more effectively than any Soviet army could, delaying their advance again and again until November's winds swept the mud away and replaced it with something far worse. Snow, ice, and temperatures so bitter that fuel thickened, rifles malfunctioned, boots froze solid, and soldiers wrapped themselves in anything they could find. Curtains torn from houses, sacks, rags, anything to keep their fingers from numbing in the killing cold. By the time German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow in early December, many divisions were operating at half strength, their ranks devastated by exhaustion, hunger, frostbite, and equipment failures, while Soviet forces, newly reinforced by Siberian divisions trained for winter warfare, launched a massive counter-offensive that stunned the Germans and sent them reeling backward through the snow-covered forests. And as German soldiers stumbled into defensive positions miles behind their starting lines, their confidence shattered, their supply lines collapsing, their commanders pleading for reinforcements that did not exist, the truth Hitler refused to acknowledge became clear to every man freezing on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion meant to secure Germany's destiny, had become the battle he never should have started, a campaign not of months but of years, a war not of conquest, but of attrition, fought against a nation too vast to outmaneuver, too resilient to break, and too hardened by history to surrender its homeland. And in that realization lay the seed of Germany's ultimate defeat, planted on a quiet dawn in June when the first artillery shells crossed the border and a war of unimaginable scale began. Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. June 22, 1941, 11:40 a.m., as the sun climbed higher over the smoking fields of Belarus and Lithuania, and the echoes of the invasion still rippled across rivers, forests, and villages that only hours earlier had been untouched by war, the German High Command believed the stunning momentum of their opening blow confirmed everything Hitler had promised. The Soviet Union was cracking. Soviet defenses were disorganized. Soviet commanders were confused. And Soviet units were retreating in waves that seemed to validate the myth of the Red Army as a clumsy, fragile force. Yet beneath those early victories lay a deeper truth unseen from Berlin's polished conference rooms. The Soviet Union had absorbed the shock, steadied its footing, and begun to react with a cold, methodical determination that would only grow stronger as the hours stretched into days. As German armored columns thundered east, dust trailing behind them in long ribbons visible for miles, Soviet civilians fled along the roads in carts, bicycles, and on foot, many carrying what little they could hold, squeezing past German half-tracks that roared toward river crossings, their engines growling as they chased the promise of Moscow. But even as villages fell in hours and border towns collapsed under the weight of blitzkrieg, there were small pockets of Soviet resistance that surprised the invading troops, platoons that refused to surrender, machine gun nests firing until surrounded, NKVD detachments holding bridges with stubborn defiance. And though these actions rarely stopped the German advance, they slowed it, fracturing the perfect schedule Hitler demanded and forcing commanders to adjust constantly to small but accumulating delays. At the same time, far behind the front, Stalin's government reeled from the shock of betrayal. For months, he had insisted Hitler would not attack, even as German troops massed on the border. And now, in the span of a single morning, the Soviet Union found itself thrust into the largest invasion in its history, with communication networks disrupted, frontline generals unable to reach Moscow, and entire divisions cut off before receiving their first official orders. Yet, in that chaos, a monumental shift occurred. Stalin, initially paralyzed by disbelief, regained control of his government, issuing decrees that mobilized the full weight of Soviet industry, personnel, and resources. Factories in western cities, Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk, were ordered to evacuate immediately, and thousands of workers, many of them teenagers or elderly civilians, began dismantling machine tools, turbines, and assembly lines, loading them onto trains headed east toward the Ural Mountains. This massive relocation, unprecedented in speed and scale, would soon resurrect Soviet industry far from German reach, ensuring that even as the Wehrmacht swept across the frontier, the Soviet war machine would not die. Meanwhile, German spearheads, led by experienced commanders like Guderian and Hoth, pressed relentlessly forward, crossing rivers before Soviet engineers could destroy the bridges, capturing rail junctions that had been critical to Soviet logistics, and sweeping up prisoners in numbers that astonished German intelligence. But with every mile gained, supply trucks groaned under the strain of distance, radios struggled under faulty connections, and field hospitals reported growing shortages of medicine, spare parts, and fuel, early signs that the invasion, though successful on paper, had already begun to stretch the Wehrmacht beyond the limits its logistics were designed to handle. And as June gave way to early July, the scale of the Eastern Front revealed itself as a force neither side could fully control. Storms swept across open plains with sudden ferocity, drenching roads and bogging down infantry columns, while forest fires ignited from artillery strikes, sending smoke curling through birch groves where German reconnaissance units crept forward uncertainly, wary of ambush. Yet the Soviet Union, though staggered by the opening blow, showed no signs of collapse. Instead, new reserve armies formed behind the front, composed of men who had never before held a rifle, but who marched with a sense of duty rooted not in politics but in survival, for they understood instinctively that the fall of the Soviet Union would not mean occupation. It would mean annihilation of their homeland. These reservists boarded trains that rattled east and west, many reciting whispered prayers or holding letters from families already fleeing deeper into the interior, and as they were deployed near major cities, the first true defensive lines began to take shape. Trenches dug in haste, barricades built from timber and sandbags, anti-tank guns positioned along narrow forest roads, defensive belts designed to slow the panzer spearheads, whose speed had become both their greatest weapon and their greatest vulnerability. Yet Hitler, intoxicated by early victories, refused to acknowledge that the Soviet Union was adapting. He interpreted every gain as confirmation that his assumptions were correct, that the morale of Soviet troops was failing, and that once a few major cities fell, Riga, Minsk, Smolensk, the entire nation would crumble. But in the Soviet Union, morale was not collapsing. It was hardening. News of atrocities, displacement, villages burned, and families uprooted spread quickly, igniting an emotional resistance that went beyond orders. Soldiers fought not only for their state but for their land, their families, their memories. Commissars delivered speeches at dawn that echoed through smoky encampments, insisting that retreat was temporary and that the Red Army would reclaim every inch of lost ground. And beyond the human will to fight, another force shaped the battlefield: the miles themselves. German tanks burned fuel faster than supply convoys could deliver it. Trucks carrying ammunition wore out their tires on rough roads. Horses, thousands of them used to move artillery, struggled through marshes and forests. Mechanics slept 3 hours a night, repairing engines pushed well beyond their intended lifespan. And through it all, Soviet forces continued withdrawing just far enough to avoid encirclement, drawing the Germans deeper, stretching their lines thinner, and buying time for something Hitler had never accounted for: the reorganization of the Soviet High Command. In early July, Stalin appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov as one of the key architects of the defense. Pragmatic, relentless, and deeply intuitive, Zhukov understood that the Soviet Union could not stop the Germans at the frontier. Instead, he envisioned a strategy of depth, allowing territory to be lost while preserving manpower and equipment for future counterblows. This strategy, controversial and painful, would soon prove decisive. Meanwhile, German commanders grew increasingly frustrated by Hitler's constant interference. He demanded rapid advances east, changes in direction, encirclement operations that drained fuel and ammunition, all while ignoring the warnings of officers who had fought in World War I and recognized the danger of overextension. Letters sent home by German soldiers began to shift in tone. What had been confident declarations of victory in weeks became cautious descriptions of long marches, stubborn resistance, and exhaustion setting in earlier than expected. Still the advance continued. Smolensk fell in July, opening the gateway to Moscow. Yet victory there came at a cost: delays, logistical strain, and the first significant signs that the Soviet Union was not collapsing but organizing. Soviet forces launched counterattacks around Smolensk that, while costly, forced the Germans to commit reserves earlier than planned. These counterattacks bought precious time, allowing Moscow to strengthen its defenses and preparing the stage for the battles that would define the Eastern Front. Deep in the Kremlin, Stalin held meetings late into the night, smoking endlessly as he listened to reports of factories being re-established far east of the Ural Mountains, new tank designs accelerating in production, and fresh divisions forming from Siberia, Central Asia, and the Volga region. The Soviets now understood two things clearly: Germany was strong, but not invincible, and the true battle, the one that would decide the fate of the war, had not yet begun. And through July's heat, as wheat fields rippled beside scorching highways and German tanks rested in villages seized after lightning-fast assaults, the distant rumble of Soviet industry, reborn in the east, signaled the beginning of a transformation that would soon turn the tide against the invaders. German officers, mapping new objectives by lantern light, still believed Moscow would fall before autumn. But in the forests beyond the Dnieper River, Soviet partisans began forming small, agile units that struck at supply lines, derailed trains, and vanished into the night. Every day, a few more convoys failed to arrive. Every week, ammunition showed up late. Every month, fuel shortages forced delays. Barbarossa, meant to be swift, was already slowing. And although Berlin celebrated the fall of major cities, the truth whispered through the ranks of the Wehrmacht. The Soviet Union was not defeated, it was awakening. And the deeper Germany advanced, the more the vastness, the harshness, and the unyielding spirit of the East revealed themselves, preparing to drag the invaders into a struggle far longer and far more devastating than Hitler had ever imagined. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. July 17, 1941, late afternoon, as a copper haze settled over the endless grain fields of western Russia, and the low rumble of distant artillery echoed across valleys that only weeks earlier had known nothing louder than the wind through the grass, the German offensive pressed onward toward the heart of the Soviet Union. But with each passing day the speed that had once defined blitzkrieg began to dull, slowed by distance, resistance, and a land that fought back with space alone. And in the Command tents of Army Group Center. Officers who once celebrated rapid victories now studied maps marked with growing questions. Why had the Soviet armies, supposedly shattered, continued regrouping? How could so many new units appear so quickly? Why did every breakthrough seem to reveal yet more lines of defense rather than collapse? Even as German troops captured key cities like Mogilev and Orsha, the Red Army's stubborn defense chipped time away from Hitler's carefully imagined schedule, and after the great encirclement battles near Smolensk, where thousands of Soviet troops were overtaken by German maneuvering, something unexpected occurred. The Soviets did not break. Instead, they counterattacked with such tenacity that German units, already marching for weeks, found themselves forced into sudden defensive operations. And for the first time in the campaign, German commanders realized the Soviet Union had reserves far behind the front, formations pulled from deep across the continent. Brought west by rail lines, the Germans struggled to disrupt across such massive distances. Meanwhile, the landscape itself shifted from one challenge to another. The open farmland that had favored panzers faded into dense forests and marshlands where armored columns slowed to a crawl, and the long straight roads that carried German infantry forward grew narrower, rougher, dustier, making supply efforts harder than the High Command had predicted. The Luftwaffe, triumphant in the opening days, now faced new problems as Soviet aircraft, though fewer, appeared with increasing frequency, piloted by aviators who flew with the determination of men defending their last horizon. German pilots, once certain of uncontested skies, now found themselves engaged in longer, harder battles, forced to fly further from their bases and return with fuel gauges hovering at the edge of danger. And yet, Berlin continued demanding speed. Hitler insisted that Moscow must fall before the autumn rains and winter cold, that Leningrad and Kiev must be captured, that the Soviet state must be dismantled piece by piece before the year ended. But the realities of the Eastern Front did not bend to his will. Soviet commanders, Zhukov, Timoshenko, Rokossovsky, adapted, reorganizing forces in depth rather than allowing them to be isolated. Factories far to the east resumed production, filling the railways with new equipment. Civilians worked tirelessly digging defensive lines, cutting logs for fortifications, and preparing the earth itself to resist the German advance. And throughout July and early August, the Wehrmacht continued marching east, yet the morale within its ranks subtly shifted. Letters home spoke less of quick victory and more of exhausting marches, unending horizons, and an enemy that seemed to appear everywhere despite repeated defeats. Soldiers who had expected a summer campaign now began to wonder what would happen if winter arrived before they completed their objectives. German generals, well aware of logistics, quietly expressed concerns to the High Command. Concerns Hitler brushed aside, convinced the Soviet Union would collapse once another few major cities fell. But in the Soviet interior, the opposite was occurring. Trainloads of evacuated machinery reached the Urals, where workers immediately began assembling new factories. Thousands of volunteers enlisted to defend cities still far from the front. Soviet engineers blasted bridges and railway yards behind them to slow the German advance, and partisan groups, forming deep within forests, launched their first sabotage operations against German supply convoys, derailing trains and cutting communication lines, leaving German officers frustrated as they tried to understand how an enemy supposedly near defeat could operate with such coordination. In the heat-drenched forests near Yelnya, one of the first organized Soviet counteroffensives erupted in late August, surprising German forces who had believed their adversary incapable of such cohesion. Though not decisive in the large strategic sense, this counterattack proved something critical. Soviet troops were capable of regaining ground, capable of adapting, capable of resisting with structured determination rather than chaotic retreat. Reports reaching Moscow carried the first embers of renewed confidence, while reports reaching Berlin began to hint, in cautious language, that Barbarossa was not progressing as flawlessly as Hitler continued to claim. Yet the German advance still moved forward, driven by discipline, doctrine, and a belief that victory lay just ahead, a belief strengthened by Hitler's late summer decision to divert armored forces south toward Kiev, a move that many generals argued against, but one that Hitler insisted would crush Soviet armies in Ukraine and secure vital resources. This diversion, though tactically impressive, consumed weeks of precious time that Moscow used to fortify itself with rings of defenses stretching across miles of forest and countryside, preparing the capital for the onslaught they knew would come. And even as stunning encirclement battles unfolded near Kiev, battles that struck heavy blows against Soviet formations, the German commanders overseeing Army Group Center knew the price. The road to Moscow was now delayed until autumn, and autumn in the Soviet Union carried warnings older than any modern nation, warnings written in mud and rain and wind. But Hitler's confidence remained unshaken. He believed the Soviet Union stood on the edge of collapse, that one final push could topple Stalin's regime, and toward the end of September he ordered Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow. German troops, exhausted but determined, prepared for the last great drive before winter. Yet as they moved east, the skies began to shift in tone. Clouds thickened, winds cooled, and the first raindrops fell across the long supply roads, turning dust into sludge and slowing every movement. Still the Germans pressed forward, hopeful that speed alone might overcome nature. But early October brought the full force of the Rasputitsa, the legendary mud season, transforming the landscape into a mire so heavy that wagons sank to their axles, tanks bogged down, and soldiers marched with boots coated in layers of sticky, suctioning earth. Supply convoys fell behind, horses strained to pull artillery, and mechanics worked day and night to free vehicles from the clinging grip of the mud. The offensive slowed to a crawl, yet Hitler insisted that Moscow remain within reach. And as the Germans struggled forward, Soviet forces stiffened further, launching renewed counterattacks along key defensive points, disrupting the German timetable again and again. Behind these lines, the city of Moscow prepared for battle with unwavering resolve. Civilians built trenches, anti-tank barriers filled roads, factories operated day and night producing weapons and equipment, and Stalin himself chose to remain in the city, a symbolic decision that reinforced Soviet morale. Meanwhile, the German troops pushing slowly toward the capital began to experience the first thin veil of frost in the morning air, a signal of the approaching winter they were neither trained nor equipped for. Tired commanders urged caution. Hitler demanded acceleration. And across the entire front, the first snowflakes fell, gently, quietly, almost innocently, unaware that they marked the beginning of the greatest crisis the Wehrmacht had ever faced. For winter was coming, and winter in the east was not a season but an adversary, one that fought not with weapons but with cold, distance, and the slow eroding of human endurance. And as the clouds thickened and temperatures dropped, Operation Barbarossa, once envisioned as a triumphant march to swift victory, now began to reveal its true nature, a vast, grinding struggle against an enemy who refused to collapse and a land that punished every mile gained. The mistakes made in planning, underestimating Soviet resilience, overestimating German logistics, ignoring the scale of the East, now gathered like storm clouds over the horizon, ready to turn a bold invasion into a catastrophic miscalculation that would define the rest of the war. October 12, 1941, early morning, as a pale, colorless sun struggled to rise above the marshlands west of Moscow and frost clung to the branches like thin shards of glass, the German advance resumed with a mixture of strained determination and creeping dread, for the frost brought clearer roads but also colder nights, and soldiers who had once marched confidently now awoke shivering in thin uniforms never meant for the deep chills of the Russian autumn, as tanks growled forward through forests glazed with ice. Commanders realized with unsettling clarity that the window for capturing Moscow was shrinking by the hour, yet Hitler continued pressing for speed, insisting that victory was within reach if only his armies pushed harder, faster, deeper into Soviet defenses. But the truth revealed itself mile by mile as the panzers reached the outskirts of Vyazma and Bryansk, where Soviet forces, believed shattered weeks earlier, launched a coordinated defense that stunned the German high command, turning supposedly open roads into contested battle zones and forcing German troops to fight for every inch. Behind those Soviet lines, new units poured toward the front, Siberian divisions hardened by winters far colder than anything Germany had ever experienced, their arrival made possible by Japanese decisions in the Far East that convinced Stalin he could finally redeploy massive forces west without risking an attack from Manchuria. These troops, wearing winter coats and trained for operations in freezing temperatures, moved with silent discipline, contrasting starkly with German units already suffering from cold weather shortages, and as German commanders struggled to understand how the Soviets could still muster such strength, the first true winter winds swept across the plains, carrying with them the unmistakable scent of what lay ahead. Even as German forces encircled Vyazma and Bryansk in late October, creating huge pockets of Soviet resistance, victory carried a muted edge, for the German troops gained land at the cost of exhaustion, dwindling supplies, and a growing sense that time itself was turning against them. Fuel trucks lagged behind by days, infantry marched with worn-out boots that split at the seams, and medical officers sent increasingly desperate reports regarding frostbite, pneumonia, and fatigue. Meanwhile, Stalin addressed the Soviet people directly from Moscow, declaring that the city would not fall, that the Red Army would hold the line at any cost, and that factories must continue operating through the night no matter how close the Germans approached. The announcement echoed through apartment blocks, crowded shelters, and military headquarters, galvanizing a level of unity the Germans had not expected, and as Soviet workers produced equipment with astonishing endurance, trenches expanded around Moscow like rings of a growing fortress. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated the encirclement battles, convinced that Moscow was on the brink of collapse, yet his generals saw something different: an enemy who, despite losing ground, retained the ability to launch counterblows, an enemy who used time and distance as weapons, an enemy who understood winter in a way Germany did not. When the first heavy snowstorm struck in early November, catching supply convoys across vast open plains, wagons froze into place, engines refused to start, and horses stood trembling against sheets of icy wind. German soldiers huddled together, their breath forming pale fog in the air, and many realized with a quiet dread that their advance was slowing not because of Soviet resistance alone but because of nature itself. Yet the drive toward Moscow continued, pushing into forests where snow muffled footsteps and turned paths into treacherous slopes, where visibility dropped so low that soldiers saw only silhouettes in the swirling white, where tanks crawled like exhausted animals struggling through drifts that reached their hulls. The closer the Germans came to Moscow, the harder each mile became. Observers inside the city reported the distant thunder of artillery growing louder each day, and Soviet leadership prepared for the possibility of urban conflict, yet behind the scenes they were confident, for they knew reinforcements from the east were still arriving, divisions of disciplined, winter-hardened troops ready to test the German advance just as temperatures plunged toward levels the Wehrmacht had never trained for. German officers, desperate for warm clothing, sent repeated requests back to the Reich, but supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, and winter gear that had been dismissed as unnecessary months earlier was now impossible to deliver in time. Many soldiers fashioned makeshift coverings from blankets and torn fabric, but such improvisations offered little protection against the growing cold. Still, the offensive pressed on, driven by Hitler's insistence that the Soviet Union was days away from collapse, and by mid-November the Germans reached positions from which they could see Moscow's outskirts through binoculars, the faint outline of distant buildings, smoke rising from industrial zones, and the knowledge that the capital lay just beyond the horizon. Yet the sight of Moscow did not bring triumph. Instead it brought a rising sense of unease, for temperatures had dropped again, supplies were critically low, and the Soviets, far from breaking, were fortifying their lines with increasing strength. When the German command launched the final push toward Moscow on November 15th, snow covered the land like a silent warning, and the freezing wind cut across the plains with a sharpness that made every breath feel heavy. Tanks advanced slowly despite frozen oil, infantry marched with scarves of frost around their faces, and horses struggled to pull artillery through the deepening white. Soviet forces, prepared for winter, countered with precision, launching small but effective strikes along key roads, disrupting German movement and forcing units to expend precious fuel just to maintain positions. The closer the Germans came to Moscow, the more resistance stiffened. Siberian troops held their ground with unwavering discipline, anti-tank crews braved the cold with steady focus, and entire Soviet formations maneuvered with an agility that stunned German officers who had expected scattered defenders rather than coordinated armies. Reports reaching Berlin described severe cold, increasing losses, and a Soviet defense far stronger than predicted. Yet Hitler refused to halt the offensive, believing that one final effort might break the Soviet will. But by early December, temperatures plunged to levels that seemed almost unreal to German troops. Cold so sharp it cracked steel, froze machine gun mechanisms, and turned the ground beneath their boots into a rigid plain of glass. Soldiers found their breath freezing inside field tents, engines required fires lit beneath them just to turn over, and rifles malfunctioned unless carefully warmed inside coats. Even so, German units attempted one last assault toward the city, advancing through snowfields under pale winter light. They came within kilometers of Moscow, close enough to sense the city's presence, close enough to see the faint glow over the skyline, yet unable to break Soviet defenses hardened not just by winter but by determination. And then, like a shift in the wind, the Soviet counteroffensive began. Fresh divisions, wearing white winter camouflage and equipped for the freezing temperatures, surged forward with speed and coordination that shocked German lines already weakened by cold and exhaustion. The push forced German units back from their advanced positions, reversing gains that had taken weeks to achieve. German commanders, stunned, realized they were facing not an exhausted enemy, but a rejuvenated one, fueled by reserves Germany no longer had and protected by winter conditions that favored the defenders overwhelmingly. The retreat began slowly at first, step by step, then accelerated as Soviet pressure increased. Soldiers who had once marched east with confidence now trudged west against icy winds, carrying equipment frozen to their hands, slipping through snowdrifts illuminated by the pale, unyielding glow of the winter sky. For the first time since the invasion began, German troops felt something unfamiliar and deeply unsettling, the sense that momentum had shifted, that their offensive had reached its limit, and that the vast, unforgiving Russian winter was no longer simply a backdrop but an active adversary shaping the fate of the war. December 10, 1941, late afternoon, as the pale sun sank behind the snow-choked forests west of Moscow and shadows stretched long across frozen fields where abandoned German equipment lay half-buried in drifts, the Soviet counteroffensive raged forward with a confidence and precision that stunned the Wehrmacht, driving exhausted divisions into a retreat they could scarcely control. For the winter struck harder with each passing night, turning roads into sheets of ice and winds into knives. That sliced through thin German uniforms, and even as officers tried to rally their troops, they faced the bitter truth that their forces, stretched thin after months of non-stop advance, had neither the strength nor the warmth to resist the oncoming wave. Siberian soldiers, hardened by climates far colder than the brutal temperatures gripping western Russia, moved across the snow with an ease that German troops could only envy, their white camouflage blending seamlessly with the terrain, their rifles functioning reliably in conditions that froze German weapons solid, and as they pressed forward, they struck German lines in coordinated blows that shattered the illusion of German invincibility that had carried through the summer months. German commanders sent frantic messages to Berlin detailing the collapse of entire sectors, the inability of tanks to maneuver in the deep snow, the impossibility of holding positions without winter clothing, fuel, or functioning engines, but the High Command, still in the grip of Hitler's belief that the Soviets were on the brink of collapse, hesitated to authorize full withdrawal, insisting instead that the front must hold, that the crisis was temporary, that morale must not falter even as the temperature plunged to levels colder than any German meteorologist had predicted. But on the front lines the crisis was not temporary. It was immediate, physical, and relentless. Soldiers found frost forming on their faces before sunrise, boots stiffening like wooden blocks, fingers losing sensation within minutes of exposure. Some lit small fires hidden in trenches just to keep their weapons warm enough to operate, while others huddled in ruined villages burned out by earlier battles, scraping together bits of wood to create fleeting warmth as Soviet artillery echoed in the distance. The Wehrmacht, once the embodiment of modern mechanized warfare, now struggled to move equipment designed for European climates across landscapes transformed into fields of frozen misery. Tanks stalled when their engines seized, trucks skidded across icy roads or refused to start altogether, and horses, the backbone of German logistics, collapsed from exhaustion and cold, leaving supply lines frayed and chaotic. Meanwhile, Soviet forces pressed relentlessly forward, aware that their advantage grew with every drop in temperature. Generals monitoring the advance in Moscow recognized that for the first time since the invasion began, the Red Army held the strategic initiative, and they intended to use it fully. As they recaptured town after town, Soviet morale surged, fed by the knowledge that they had not only stopped the once unstoppable German advance, but had pushed it backward under conditions that favored Soviet endurance and punished German unpreparedness. Civilians who had endured the terror of occupation watched with renewed hope as Red Army troops marched into their villages, offering not only liberation but proof that the Soviet Union could resist Hitler's might. In German headquarters, however, fear grew as reports accumulated. Entire divisions had fallen back in disarray. Officers struggled to maintain cohesion across lines. Communications broke down as freezing temperatures disrupted radios, and roads that had once facilitated rapid advances now trapped vehicles in deep snow where recovery crews could not reach them. Some German units attempted improvised defenses, digging into the frozen earth with tools that shattered on impact, erecting makeshift barricades from snow and debris, and positioning themselves along ridges in hopes of halting Soviet momentum. But these lines often crumbled under coordinated attacks carried out by fresh Soviet formations rotating through the front. The German retreat became not a single movement but a series of staggered withdrawals across hundreds of miles, each one marked by exhaustion and cold, each one widening the gap between Hitler's expectations and the reality faced by frontline troops. At night the winds howled across the plains, carrying with them the eerie sound of artillery fighting through the storm, and soldiers lying in shallow trenches felt the cold pressing into their bones, making sleep difficult and movement painful. Some muttered about the cruelty of nature, others about the failures of leadership, but all recognized that the campaign which had begun with such confidence in June had transformed into a desperate struggle for survival by December. The Soviet counteroffensive expanded across the entire front, from Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south, forcing German formations into deeper and deeper retreats and preventing any chance of regrouping. For many German officers, the realization dawned that Operation Barbarossa, the grand plan designed to conquer the Soviet Union in a single season, had irrevocably failed. The assumptions that had guided its planning, from the belief in swift victory to the dismissal of Soviet industrial capacity, had collapsed under the combined weight of Soviet endurance and the merciless Russian winter. Yet despite the grim reality, Hitler refused to authorize a general retreat, ordering instead that all units hold their positions to the last man, a directive that commanders often ignored out of necessity, withdrawing their troops to avoid encirclement by rapidly advancing Soviet forces. In Berlin, tensions rose as military advisers warned that the Eastern Front could collapse entirely if troops were not allowed to fall back to defensible positions, but Hitler dismissed such warnings as defeatism, insisting that the harsh winter was temporary and that spring would bring renewed opportunities for victory. His refusal to acknowledge the scale of the crisis deepened the struggle for frontline units already fighting against cold, exhaustion, and Soviet pressure. Some divisions, reduced to a fraction of their original strength, attempted to re-establish defensive lines near towns whose names would soon be etched into German military reports as sites of desperate winter battles: Klin, Kaluga, Mozhaevsk, and dozens of others. But the Soviet Union, sensing growing momentum, pressed forward with determination, aiming to push the Germans far enough west to eliminate the immediate threat to Moscow and to demonstrate to both the Soviet people and the world that the invader could be beaten. Snowstorms swept across the landscape like a curtain of white, obscuring vision and slowing movement, yet Soviet units pushed through them with practiced skill, using skis and sleds to navigate terrain that trapped German troops in place. And as December gave way to January, the German army, already battered by cold and exhaustion, found itself faced with the reality that the Eastern Front could no longer be won with speed, for the era of blitzkrieg had ended. The war had turned into a vast, grinding struggle across terrains and temperatures the Wehrmacht had never prepared for, and Operation Barbarossa, once envisioned as a lightning campaign, had become the greatest miscalculation of Hitler's military career. A miscalculation, measured not in days or weeks, but in the frozen miles that now separated German forces from the victory they had been promised. January 3, 1942, just before dawn, as a pale ribbon of light crept across the frozen horizon and the land stirred beneath temperatures so brutal they seemed to silence even the wind, the German retreat west of Moscow entered a new and desperate phase, for the Soviet counteroffensive, fueled by fresh reinforcements and the unbreakable will of a nation defending its very existence, pushed forward with an intensity that left German divisions reeling, unable to form stable defensive lines as the Red Army struck again and again across hundreds of miles, and though German officers attempted to slow the advance by forming hedgehog positions, small fortified clusters designed to hold ground even when surrounded. These strongpoints often collapsed under coordinated Soviet assaults that combined infantry, artillery, and shock troops moving through snow-covered forests with the precision of men who knew the terrain intimately, while German soldiers, many barely able to stand from fatigue and cold, struggled to navigate the same terrain in uniforms stiffened by frost and weapons that jammed with every drop in temperature. Across the vast white expanse, the signs of German overextension became impossible to ignore. Horses collapsed in the snow and were abandoned where they fell. Trucks froze solid and transformed into immovable obstacles. Fuel drums shattered from the cold, and long lines of soldiers trudged through knee-deep drifts with their faces wrapped in torn blankets to shield them from the bitter air. In makeshift shelters carved from ruined houses or dug hastily beneath snowbanks, German troops gathered around small fires that barely pierced the freezing darkness, listening to artillery rumble like distant thunder, while commanders tried to explain that they must hold their positions despite the overwhelming Soviet pressure. Yet even the officers felt the weight of the truth. The great campaign that had begun with such confidence had unraveled into a grim struggle for survival, and there, men, once energized by swift victories, now fought not for conquest but simply to endure the night. Soviet forces, emboldened by each breakthrough, continued pressing west with a sense of momentum that bordered on unstoppable, capturing villages and crossroads that the Germans had depended upon for supply routes. Every regained settlement brought new morale to Soviet troops and new despair to German units forced to retreat through landscapes that seemed to stretch endlessly into defeat. In Moscow, the atmosphere shifted from desperation to quiet determination as news of the continued retreat filtered through military headquarters. Stalin, encouraged by the progress, pressed his generals to drive the enemy further back before the spring thaw, knowing that German forces, weakened by winter and stretched thin across thousands of miles, could be pushed far from the capital if the Soviets maintained their momentum. And indeed, Soviet command saw opportunity everywhere. The frozen rivers that once seemed obstacles now became highways for infantry on skis. Forests that had hindered summer maneuvers now offered concealment for rapid winter strikes, and the bitter cold, which punished every German unit, only strengthened Soviet resolve. For these were conditions the Red Army understood and endured with the instinct of a nation shaped by harsh winters. Meanwhile, inside German headquarters, the mood darkened into something close to disbelief as reports detailed the collapse of multiple divisions, the disorder of communication lines, the impossibility of forming a coherent defensive front. Generals pleaded with Berlin for permission to conduct controlled withdrawals to stronger positions, but Hitler, clinging stubbornly to the belief that retreat would cause the entire Eastern Front to unravel, issued strict directives forbidding further withdrawals, insisting that every soldier must stand firm regardless of cost. Yet the realities of winter warfare did not bend to ideology. Communication officers found their radio equipment frozen, supply commanders wept over lost convoys abandoned in the snow, and infantry units reported that frostbite was claiming more men than Soviet bullets. Some soldiers described the cold as an invisible enemy stalking them through the night, draining strength, stealing morale, and leaving even seasoned veterans shaken. And as temperatures dropped below levels considered survivable, soldiers relied on desperate improvisations, wrapping rags around their legs, burning fragments of furniture inside ruined houses, sleeping in groups just to preserve body heat. But none of it was enough. Soviet offensives struck again in late January, targeting German positions near Kaluga, Rzhev, and Orel, forcing yet more retreats and stretching the German army into a long, uneven line that no longer resembled the disciplined force that had stormed across the Soviet border in June. And while German generals struggled to maintain cohesion, the Soviets grew more confident, their troops advancing with the vigor of a nation that felt victory within reach, even if only on a localized scale. Each success reinforced the belief that the invader could be beaten, that the massive cost of defending the motherland had meaning, and that the sacrifice of millions would not be in vain. Soviet soldiers marched with renewed purpose, knowing that behind them lay families who had endured bombings, starvation, and occupation, and ahead lay an enemy that had believed itself unstoppable, an enemy now visibly faltering. The psychological shift across the Eastern Front became undeniable. German troops, once filled with an aura of supremacy, now doubted their leadership, their chances, even their purpose, while Soviet forces, once fighting with desperation, now fought with conviction. And as winter deepened and the retreat continued, something else became clear. Operation Barbarossa had already failed in its fundamental objective. The Soviets had not collapsed. Moscow had not fallen. The German army had not achieved the swift victory Hitler promised. Instead, the Eastern Front had transformed into a war of attrition, a vast, grinding conflict that demanded resources Germany did not have and endurance it could not match. The winter of 1941–42 became the turning point not through any single battle, but through the accumulation of thousands of small defeats, frozen patrols forced back by snowstorms, motorized units stranded for lack of fuel, artillery batteries unable to fire because their mechanisms froze solid, soldiers succumbing to cold as much as exhaustion. When February arrived, bringing slightly warmer winds but no reprieve from Soviet pressure, German commanders finally issued controlled withdrawals, ignoring Hitler's directives in order to save what remained of their forces. These withdrawals created a defensive line farther west, but they also marked the undeniable end of the German dream of conquering the Soviet Union in one season. And as the snow began to soften and the first hints of spring crept across the edges of the battle-scarred landscape, both armies understood a new reality. The war would not be quick. It would not be won by speed or shock. It would become a prolonged struggle decided by endurance, production, and sheer will. Operation Barbarossa had not only failed, it had reshaped the war into something far larger than Hitler ever imagined, a conflict that would stretch across years, continents, and millions of lives. And as German troops dug into defensive positions that spring, staring across fields that had nearly swallowed them, they knew the truth that their leaders had refused to admit. The East was a battlefield unlike any other, and the winter they had just endured was not a temporary setback but a permanent lesson, a reminder that the Soviet Union, far from collapsing, had risen stronger than before, turning the cold itself into a weapon Germany had never prepared to face. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.